So let's get started. Professor Nathan, Sharon, Michael, ladies and gentlemen of the audience, good evening or good morning. Welcome to another NSL seminar, and this time it takes a new form of a book launching. Thank you for attending this seminar at this very odd hours. My name is Fu Hualin. I'm the Dean of the Faculty of Law at the University of Hong Kong. Professor Michael Davis has written a very timely book. The title of the book is Making Hong Kong China, the Rollback of Human Rights and the Rule of Law. It is published by Columbia University Press. So it's the evidence that we have the book in hand. So it's a great book. So buy the book, read the book, and discuss the book. The author will introduce the book for about 20 minutes. Following that, Professor Andy Nathan and Sharon will give their comments. Each would have about 10 to 15 minutes. Let me just introduce Michael briefly. Michael teaches in our faculty this semester as a visiting professor. He is teaching courses on international human rights. He's also currently a global fellow at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars in Washington, D.C., and a professor of law and international affairs at OP Jindal Global University in India. So Michael, the floor is yours.
Oh, thank you, Hualing, and I appreciate the chance to talk about Hong Kong, in Hong Kong, as it were, because this is where we're being from. I mean, I'm in New York and our other speakers are in New York, but of course, our hearts are all in Hong Kong, and this event is there. So I appreciate it very much. I'll try to give as quick an overview as I can of what I was trying to do with the book. I guess that's the way I'll approach it. And because I really want to hear more from Professor Nathan and Professor Holm. So I'll be rather quick. I think one of the main things I wanted to do, and maybe I'll preface all of this saying, even though the book comes across as very critical, the goal is not to bash China, but to convince people that maybe there are ways to sort of bridge the gap with Hong Kong and come to the kinds of solutions that everybody would like to see of a prosperous, successful society without using the methods that we're using at the moment and what have evolved over the years. As Andy Nathan's blurb in the front of the book, on the back of the book, I guess, suggests, one of the things that I really wanted to do with the book is especially point out that what we're seeing now is, quite a crisis, but these things didn't happen just this year and last year. That the groundwork for what the problems we're having right now go all the way back to the handover and before it. And so in the book, I try in various chapters to lay out this progression of what I see as the problem. We all know why we have one country, two systems. I assume if someone signs up for this, they know that it promised Hong Kong a high degree of autonomy with the rule of law as promised under the common law system and basic freedoms and human rights. And it included various provisions to keep Hong Kong autonomous by not applying mainland law unless it's listed in an annex to the basic law, and admonishing mainland departments not to interfere in Hong Kong in areas of autonomy. These departments, as I think it says, under the central government in the basic law. So it clearly had some kind of vision that Hong Kong would function in an autonomous way. And I say it's a very liberal vision for Hong Kong. This could be contested, but when you really look at things like the way the rule of law is promised and that the basic law is a superior sort of constitution, a written constitution, and the courts are allowed to evaluate the acts of executive officials in carrying out their duties, and so on. There's a big debate recently whether Hong Kong has separation of powers. I don't think anybody who studies the basic law would judge otherwise, that even Carrie Lam, when she was saying there was no separation of powers, at the same time says there's just separate departments with separate power and they have checks and balances on each other. That is separation of powers. So she was in effect trying to say there was none, I suppose, because mainland officials like to say that. And they use it, and one of the things in the character of the basic law, mainland officials will often say that it's an executive-led system and not separation of powers. I would say an executive-led system is exactly the system that needs separation of powers, as the basic law would provide. Parliamentary systems have much less separation of powers because the executive is in the parliament. And if you have a parliamentary system, the one that Hong Kong's most familiar with, that it's inherited from Britain, it even had parliamentary supremacy, so that the courts had limited capacity to override or to invalidate anything that was done by Parliament. That increased a little bit after Hong Kong was handed over, when the British Human Rights Act was passed. But for the most part, the executive-led character is what would lead us to this separation of powers. And the liberal character, I would say, is also very evident when you look at the rights guarantees in the basic law. There's something like 16 different rights, and half of them relate to free speech in one form or another. So this I would say, is the character of the project. It was designed to let Hong Kong carry on doing what it does best. And the rule of law is a very core value that Hong Kong people value. I would say there are two flaws. In the book, I point out what I think are two flaws that have caused a lot of the problems we have today. One is that the system for interpreting the basic law is in the standing committee alone. When I wrote a book years and years ago advocating, before the basic law was drafted, advocating that a basic law committee be created, but I wanted that committee to function in a kind of independent way, that it would be made up of mainland and Hong Kong officials. This is a kind of model that you often see when you have autonomous regimes or federal systems, where you can have a constitutional court or a constitutional committee that can resolve conflicts between the higher and lower levels of government. But what we got instead was one where a political body in the mainland would make this decision. And I think this gave that political body a hot potato. It gave it a power that it's kind of hard for it to exercise without getting into trouble. And one that raises questions of legitimacy, because political things are overriding the basic commitments in the basic law. So there's one problem. The other was, in the basic law text was actually good. They promised universal suffrage as an ultimate aim. But because of the interpretation of the Standing Committee, it eventually wound up with a problem of dragging feet over Hong Kong's political reform. And I think this flaw, we see this protest in Hong Kong are almost always over something about this, about Hong Kong people are worried that Hong Kong's autonomy will be undermined, and thereby the rule of law will be undermined. And because the mainland system hasn't really established the rule of law as it exists in Hong Kong. So that's their worry. And when they see the Hong Kong government now being very much in a very subordinate role to the central government, and before even the recent national security law, this was the case, because the government depended on the central government. The chief executive was effectively chosen by the central government through a committee, the election committee, which was in many ways crafted to carry out the mainland's preferences. And we all have seen this happen whenever that committee selects a chief executive, that they quickly know which one the mainland officials favor, and then that committee sort of gets in line on that. And so I think Hong Kong people felt that this government is really hard pressed to defend Hong Kong's autonomy. So this is a very fundamental problem. And so the solution that Hong Kong people saw is in the basic law itself. that they would be an elected government. I don't think anybody wants an elected government that's going to be at war with the central government, but they want a Hong Kong government that has a voice, that can represent Hong Kong's interests. So almost all the protests in Hong Kong, whether it's objection to laws that are going to be passed that would undermine Hong Kong's rule of law or autonomy, or it's protest directly over democracy, all of it is more or less about trying to allow Hong Kong people some power in maintaining the autonomy for Hong Kong, to get a government that represents their interests and can find a voice to perhaps mediate that relationship between these two very different systems. So I think this is at the heart of all of it. And then when we look at the recent developments, a lot of the protests all often come down to that. And I think in a way, the problem has been in the design of this government, the way this basic law functions, has been that it actually, the Hong Kong officials and mainland officials create the protests. They in effect closed off all the avenues for Hong Kong people's voice to be heard, except through protest. They're not allowed to really elect the representatives they want with any power to make decisions on their behalf. And they face a government that they fear may not represent their interests or may be complicit in designs the mainland may have. And I don't think the mainland's designs are evil. They're just, there's a form of government in the mainland that they're comfortable with, and the system they have, which of course is why we have the basic law itself, because the one country, two systems is that mainland form of government is not very consistent with what goes on in Hong Kong, this liberal model that we're talking about, this rule of law based model. So Hong Kong people want a government that can represent them. And so the protest, when they try to demand this or demand that, through their legislators, they get nowhere. We see this even in the last week, where people are even trying to get the remaining pan-democratic legislators thrown out of the Legislative Council. So there's a perception, rather, that the people of Hong Kong have, and I've lived here in Hong Kong for 30 years, and so I've spent a lot of time with people and talking about it. There's a perception that the government doesn't really represent them in a way that's adequate to guard their autonomy. And when they want something, they started learning. We saw this with the Article 23 protest, with the patriotic education protest. They learned that the only way to get it is to go to the street. So civil society becomes the primary guardian of Hong Kong's autonomy, with some help from the judiciary. And in the way the judiciary acts to protect rights using the common law system. So this is kind of what was in place in 2019. By this time, they're finding, I think there's a perception when it comes to democracy that the government never backs down. And I think the belief is that the mainland government calls the shots when it comes to democratic reform. So the Hong Kong protest and the street protest, the civil society managed to stop the Article 23 legislation when they objected to some of its articles. They managed to stop the National Education Plan when they objected to the book that was at the heart of that and the kind of text that was being proposed. And they even last year managed to eventually get the extradition law withdrawn. But when it comes to the core problem of democratic reform, they can't seem to get anywhere. And I think that drove a kind of frustration last year and behavior that a lot of us would not like to have seen. Now, nobody wants to see violence either by the law enforcement side or the people. But what I would suggest, and what I try to articulate in the book, and I'm hoping Hong Kong officials and mainland officials could understand this, that much of the resistance they're getting in Hong Kong is driven by these conditions. In effect, their policies, the way they're executing them, have put people in a position where if their core values are to be guarded, they feel that they have to take it to the street. And so I know the central government didn't want to see this kind of massive protest either in 2003 and 2012 and 2014 or 2019, that they viewed this as a kind of loss of face in terms of their Hong Kong policy and a kind of destabilizing condition. But in effect, the way they're executing the policy and not listening to Hong Kong people, I think is causing exactly the thing they're trying to stop. So as is often the case in government, I know my own government's got its problems right now as we wait for the election results. As often the case in government, the government is its own worst enemy. The very thing it's trying to stop is being caused by its behavior. So what happens if a government is not democratic? If it's democratic, then you have an election like we see unfolding right now in America, and maybe people throw out the government. If it's not democratic, what tends to happen is the more people object, the more you repress their protest, the more they object. It's kind of Newton's law. And I think that's kind of what happened last year. And so the more this is ratcheted up, the more resistance you get, until if you're an authoritarian government, then you extremely ratchet up the constraints that you put on this society. And then you might silence the opposition, but you destroy the very thing, the very kind of society you're trying to maintain, which at least the Basic Law was trying to maintain an open society in Hong Kong. So you undermine the very foundations of that society, and it's unnecessary. So then we see the national security law. And I mean, one of the things I mentioned earlier was that the civil society is trying to guard Hong Kong's autonomy in the face of this situation, and the courts are helpful. But it's clear that when the government in Beijing and Hong Kong are trying to stop these protests in this way, by listening and trying to have a dialogue, but in effect by repressing it, then they view the courts as hostile as well. And we've seen that unfold in Hong Kong with a kind of, in this national security law, it's almost like a textbook on this unfolding. It creates these committees of direct control in Hong Kong because it's judged apparently the Hong Kong government alone was not up to the task. So the Committee on Safeguarding National Security, while headed by Hong Kong officials, has a mainland advisor, and it's said to be subordinate to the central government. So this is carrying forward even further on that path that had caused all the resistance in the first place. And then a committee, an office on safeguarding national security introduces things that are very out of place in an open society, a kind of secret kind of law enforcement body that's not subject to local jurisdiction at all, according to the national security law. Now, I argue, and even Maria Tam, of all people, argued in a panel I was on, that the national security law effectively amends the Basic Law. And I conclude in the book that when it really push comes to shove, that the national security law is higher. Now, I know my colleague and good friend here who's moderating has argued, well, that under the legislation law, that while the last law enacted is usually dominant of two national laws, if it's more specific, I think it's Articles 83 and 85, my colleague Fu Hualing has argued that basic laws are a bit different in that regard. And I hope that's right, but I think the problem would be whether a court could do much about it. You know, I mean, in theory, it might be different, but if the court doesn't have the power to exercise review over the national security law, which I think it would do at its peril, because we've had attacks on the courts exercising this kind of power, then we're kind of stuck. That even if there should be, the basic law should remain unmolested by the national security law, I think it's it's a reach. It's something that's very hard to imagine can happen. And I think the judges might struggle to interpret the national security law in favorable ways. But even when they're doing this, and if they release a prisoner or something, even under local laws on public order, they come under attack. And we've seen these attacks, some of them quite strident, written by Hong Kongers in the China Daily, like Tony Kwok and Grenville Cross and others. And so this becomes a real problem that the courts get intimidated. And we know the national security law itself wants a list of judges to do this. Now, I can see why they're doing it, because there's a kind of distrust about the courts guarding national interest. And so they're trying to find a way to control this. But in doing so, they're putting the local rule of law, I think, under extreme pressure, and the independence of the courts under extreme pressure. So I think this is the problem we face. And I want to save time for questions and answers. So the book has a lot more of analysis of this. And I think my colleagues here might mention some of what else I've said in the book, and I'm sure have much else to add themselves. But I'll leave it at that and see what aspects of this we can take up in the question and answer session.
Right. Thank you, Michael, for this very sharp and concise overview of your book. So if you have any question now, you could just write your question in the Q&A box, and we'll read and answer the questions to our best ability. So I should add that Michael had taught in both Hong Kong University Faculty of Law, but also in the Chinese University in the political science. So let's move to the discussion session. We have two very distinguished discussants. The first discussant is Professor Andrew Nathan. Andy is a class of 1919 professor of political science at Columbia University. I think there are many different ways to introduce Professor Nathan. For lawyers, especially constitutional lawyers on China, he's well known for his books on Chinese political development. The first book I read is Peking Politics, 1918 to 1923. It's a very insightful analysis of the constitutional development in late Qing and early Republican China. And also the book entitled Chinese Democracy, which is my favorite, which offers the best account, in my view, of the democratic development in the early 1980s. Of course, he's well known for his contribution to the debate on authoritarian resilience and authoritarian fragility. So I think he's the best person to place Hong Kong in the larger Chinese and global context. So Professor Nathan, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Professor Fu, very much. Yeah, Michael's book is excellent, and it gives a very insightful legal and political analysis of the situation in Hong Kong that led up to the national security law and how the national security law works. The national security law has really brought the eyes of the world to focus on Hong Kong. And there are lots of interesting questions about the development of things in Hong Kong. One of the interesting questions I want to pick up from where Michael has been speaking is about the change of identity among so many people in Hong Kong, not all of them, but large numbers. Because I remember in 1997, when Hong Kong was handed back to PRC sovereignty, at least my impression was, and I think surveys showed that most residents of Hong Kong were willing to accept the identity as citizens of the PRC within a special administrative region. They were open-minded about accepting Chinese mainland, Chinese identity and Chinese citizenship. And as time went by, there was a remarkable change in identity, perhaps especially among young people. And Michael has mentioned a number of the benchmarks that let us see that change. The Article 23 demonstrations and resistance to patriotic education. And then in 2014, the umbrella movement, and then last year and at the beginning of this year, this huge movement against the extradition agreement. So that now it seems, I don't know if we have accurate survey data, but it seems that probably a majority of Hong Kong people now adhere to a Hong Kong identity that they understand as separate from PRC citizen identity. Why did this happen? So Michael has given an astute analysis of why this happened around the idea that Hong Kong people were not allowed through democratic mechanisms to have a way to express their interests and hold government accountable to them. And I think that's a very good analysis. I think that a perhaps dominant view among Chinese officials is different from that, and that is that the Hong Kong people are dissatisfied because of economic pressures on them, the rising cost of housing, the stagnant level of wages and income. So that's quite typical of mainland Chinese authorities to think about economics as the foundation of political attitudes, and to not understand issues like identity, the value that people place on the right to express their opinions and so forth. The Beijing authorities tend to see people in Hong Kong or in Tibet or in Xinjiang as kind of economic animals who can be brought around by economic welfare. Another way to look at it that would be more in my discipline of political science might be to look at the leaders that the PRC gave to Hong Kong, the succession of chief executives, and how those chief executives were not politically astute and not politically attuned, and did things that were introducing the Article 23 legislation or introducing the extradition agreement or patriotic education, that they had a dead ear for politics. But that really converges with Michael's theory. It's just a more granular way of looking at that theory. Another question I'd like to raise that it puzzled me for a long time is why Beijing was so slow to crack down in Hong Kong, because the trend that I'm describing of growing resistance in Hong Kong to Chinese authority was going on for a long, long time, 15 or so years. And even after the umbrella movement, well, many of us in the outside world thought this is it, the Chinese government is going to send in troops, and they're going to do a Tiananmen and so forth and so on. And they didn't do that. They were very, very patient. I mean, we're now busy denouncing Beijing for introducing this national security law, but the flip side of that was for a long time they were patient and didn't do these things. Why was that? What was their strategy? Well, part of it perhaps is this economic thinking that I spoke about, that they thought, let's work on fixing the economic picture. And things will calm down. But I think a major part of it was Beijing correctly knew that the establishment in Hong Kong, the business and political establishment, the most powerful segment or stratum in Hong Kong, was loyal to Beijing, not out of ideological conviction, but out of clear sense of self-interest that Hong Kong has no alternative and we as an elite have no alternative. And Beijing placed their faith in the local government, but they, again, to go back to an earlier point, chose the wrong people to run that government. They didn't understand what it would take to run that government, and things got worse and worse. Of course, sending in troops in 2014, sending in troops anytime is very difficult prospect, and sending them into a very complicated physical location like Hong Kong and in the eyes of the world. Obviously, that's an unattractive prospect, so they held off. But finally, they did make up their mind to crack down. And that brings me to another reflection, which is on the structure of the national security law. Michael has described it. I just want to repeat and sort of put it in another framework. The national security law is an amazing structure. I don't know all the laws of all the world, but I've never heard of anything quite so airtight. It has so many levels. So the first level is in terms of enforcement, not to speak of the 4 crimes that it mentions, which themselves are, so vague as to be extraordinarily capacious and permissive. But just to speak of the enforcement mechanisms, it starts with this National Security Committee that the chief executive chairs and which is advised by and in fact really controlled and supervised by somebody who's sent from the mainland. And then on top of that, and by the way, that committee runs a secret special force within the Hong Kong police that is answerable only to it and has the power to decide which judges will hear cases. So one might think that's enough to control the situation, but it's not enough. They've added a Guan Gongshu, I think it's called, the security, or Guan Gongshu, a national security office, which is staffed by persons sent from the mainland, which has its own independent powers to carry out investigations. And then on top of this, they've arrogated to the mainland authorities the right to bring people from Hong Kong to be tried in the mainland. And then on top of that is the power of the National People's Congress Standing Committee to interpret the law in case the law comes into any question. And of course, they also have the right to interpret the basic law, so they can interpret everything the way that they want to. So this raises a question for me, that somebody wrote this structure into the law, and it's so it's so strange that it makes me wonder why they couldn't just write a normal, if you will, national security law. And my thought about that is that Beijing finally really lost faith in the Hong Kong elites and felt that if we just create a law that the Hong Kong elites themselves will manage, they won't be either willing or able to fully implement what we want them to do. So we're going to have to create layers and layers of protection for national security as that's interpreted by Beijing. The final thing I wanted to talk about a little bit is the impact of all this on American China policy. As I said at the beginning of my remarks, that the imposition of the national security law has tremendously raised the level of attention to Hong Kong around the world, and certainly in the United States. And coming to the way it fits into American political discourses that we've had under the presidency of Trump, a reinterpretation or re-envisioning of the US-China relationship as a relationship of a clash of ultimate values, of ultimate world values, of some people calling it a new Cold War. I don't think Trump personally sees it that way or cares, but people in his administration headed up by the Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, have sort of taken the bit in their teeth and have declared this new Cold War and said that China represents a whole package of values that are adverse and threatening to American values, and that it's, sort of a life and death struggle over ultimate values, which I think is a very unfortunate way of looking at it. And the various human rights issues that we certainly care about and which we've always cared about have now become more important than they were before in American China policy. And the events in Xinjiang have added a lot of fuel to that fire. And then comes the Hong Kong national security law to just prove to the sort of new Cold War faction in Washington that the PRC is a, basic enemy on sort of non-negotiable values issues. And as Michael alluded to, we have a transition we had an election, and it appears as of now, tonight, we still don't know for sure, but it appears very strongly that Biden will become the new president, and presidents have more freedom. He will probably face a Republican Congress, so he may not be able to, or Republican Senate, he may not be able to do so many things in domestic policy, but he can probably do quite a bit on foreign policy, including China policy. I think that so I want to speculate that I think that Biden's administration will seek to somewhat lower the temperature of the confrontation with China and seek to separate areas of conflict of interest with areas where cooperation is needed, such as on climate change and global public health and so forth. But that the events in Xinjiang and in Hong Kong have really made it impossible for Biden to downplay very much the issue of human rights. That issue is very important, and it's going to continue to be, even in a Biden administration, I think, a really important theme of US-China policy. And of course, the Beijing authorities, I think, are in no mood to compromise about it. They view Hong Kong truly as a national security threat, I think. And to them, it's an existential matter to maintain control over the people in Hong Kong. So I think that Hong Kong is going to continue to be a big issue in the relationship between the two countries. So there's a lot of talk in Washington about various bills that the Congress can take and things that the administration can do about Hong Kong. I don't think it's, as I said, going to change Beijing's policy, but I think we're going to see Hong Kong in the center of the US-China relationship for a long time. Thank you, Hualing. I'm done with my remarks.
Thank you very much. I think the takeaway I get is so we're shifting from the indirect rule towards a quasi direct rule. So when the direct rule will be in place, we may have some opportunities. We just have to wait and see what happens in the next few years. The other discussant is Professor Sharon Hong. Sharon is Executive Director of Human Rights in China, which is an NGO based both in Hong Kong and New York. Sharon is also an adjunct professor of law at both NYU and HKU here. She taught law for many years before joining the Human Rights in China. One thing which is truly remarkable about Sharon is she went to Beijing in 1986. I think Andy talked about the identity. I think Sharon took the identity in 1986 and decided to contribute her entire career to building rule of law, legal education, legal exchange in China. So the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Professor Fu, and this is really a pleasure to have a chance to discuss Michael's terrific book. Okay, sorry, they put a black bar across my face on my screen. I didn't know what that was about, yeah. So when Michael opened up his personal sharing in his book, and you said you landed in 1985 in Hong Kong, I did think, oh my goodness, in 1986, I landed in Beijing and to start my teaching at China University of Politics and Law. And my family said, that's crazy. Those are Northerners. Those are, you know, Beijing people. You're Cantonese. You're from the South. You don't have any family. That's not where you belong. but I did have the oddest sensation of my years teaching on the mainland that I was in many ways home, but I also felt very powerfully at home in Hong Kong. So I think that's the nature of when we think about identity. I don't think it's static. I think it's fluid, and I think that we belong to multiple communities that we claim, but sometimes they claim us, and we have loyalties, multiple loyalties. So first, I really do want to publicly congratulate Michael on a really terrific book. It's slim, but packs like really punch way above the weight of the book. And I think it's a very concise, powerful narrative about a very complex legal, social, political history of so many components and so many layers, and you make it compelling. And those of us who actually live through it, including some of these social movement activities, I was compelled. I said, wait, I was there, and this is really exciting. And I actually learned a great deal more. I got deeper perspectives, and I thought to myself, perhaps only someone who had 30 years grounding as a teacher and a thinker and a writer, and on the ground, and caring deeply, could have produced, I think, such really important insights. So thank you very much for the book. And I think anyone teaching a course related that needs a primer should really be ordering the book. So, and Michael didn't pay me for that. So that advertisement, I really think it's a terrific book.
Thank you.
Let me start, the book title, Making China Hong Kong, is in some ways provocative, some way descriptive, some way fear, and some way a challenge. I think that if you open up the aperture a little bit, the title also, as Andy's already kind of referenced briefly, it really, if you look at it in a broader context of Beijing, it is quite consistent and part of the Sinicization policy with respect to ethnic minorities, and in particular Tibetans and Uyghurs, and that the effort to make Tibetan people via their language, their culture, their history, their identity, more Chinese, or a particular vision of Chinese impose, is quite consistent. So I think we should have seen that coming well, like in 1960, 59, it was kind of in the works. So I think that that's quite consistent. It's also consistent that any exercise of cultural identity is really viewed as separatist and gets criminalized. So if you have a beard, if you wear the wrong clothing, all of that is quite consistent. And it's also consistent with the control of young people, so that young people now, including the Inner Mongolia, or so-called Inner Mongolia, and in Tibet and in Uyghur, the control of language and the control of young people. And I think that's a debate that's happening in Hong Kong, is the move to take the language and the history and the culture away from the young people first, to shape that next generation. So the title of your book really opens up a lot, and I think if we look at that. So what where I would like to pick up is your ending of the book, which is what to do. And what to do, you suggest that in all of your analysis, you first do a very clear description in the international advocacy of the kinds of advocacy that many of the groups we know and are familiar with and support are engaged in. And primarily that international advocacy has been targeting foreign governments. And so what I'd like to do in the what to do is also focus in terms of international advocacy, but in terms of international human rights law. In many parts of the book, you also reference it, like in 2003, in your activities with the lawyers and the other academics, in looking at Article 23, the first round, the bill, you did reference Johannesburg, and you referenced international standards to say, is this bill compatible with international law? And you've referenced that throughout the book in pieces. But what I'd like to do is kind of center it, and center international human rights. And when I say international human rights, I'm not talking about just formal law. And I'm talking about the standards, the principles, the mechanisms, the processes, and all the actors, the stakeholders. So I think when we think about what is the potential of that imperfect mechanism, imperfect standards, imperfect procedures to be useful to us, and us means to advance protections for Hong Kong's autonomy, protecting fundamental rights and freedom, and to protect the rule of law. How can that be useful? And I think all of it can be. And it gets a little bit too easily dismissed. In particular, the ICCPR is dismissed even by our very expert colleagues in law, because they say, ICCPR, you know, China signed it so long ago and has not ratified it. And I think it's important to highlight that China did sign and ratify every single major core human rights treaty, that is on torture, on rights of the child, on persons with disabilities, on women, and on ethnic minorities. And for the last at least 25 years that I've been doing international UN work, China has been really developing great expertise and in its engagement. Much more technical rigor, much more fluency, and much more strategic strength around how to use the UN mechanisms and engage with what I think we can describe as like a double-edged sword. One edge saying we comply, we really are engaging. And then the other end, which we're seeing more and more, is an active effort to challenge universal values, a la Document 9, but also to introduce and aggressively, actively, forcefully promote Chinese models. So Chinese models of human rights, Chinese models for development, and Chinese models for democracy. And sadly, but true, they have pointed to the US model of democracy and said, oi, what chaos, yeah? And I think they've said that system doesn't work. Look what it's produced and look what it's doing. So I think that's the other reason I am proposing we look at international human rights, because it's there and it's important for policy, it's important for the defense of cases, and it's important for the normative resources and platforms. But it's also important because China engages in a much more sophisticated way than, unfortunately, some of the other stakeholders, and that we need to be as effective in countering that. And that is also one of the valuable contributions of the book, is that you tell a narrative, and you tell a narrative that's important to preserve, because the official China story narrative, in particular about the 2019 movement, has been a narrative of violence that's focused on the violence of the particular small group of the protesters. And it really puts the whole story as chaos, law and order, the law and order story. And what your book restores is the part of the history that is about social movement, and that is about social protests by Hong Kong people for a very long time. It didn't start last year. And I think that's very important to have that narrative preserved, and that narrative be out there, particularly since the China narrative is very effectively promoted by the media and being repeated by many think tanks, unfortunately, and even governments until the most recent time. So the second reason why I think centering the human rights is very important is that the national security law itself actually has Article 4 and 5. And I think that we have not taken that seriously enough. And I know that you mentioned just in a sentence that there are no mechanisms to enforce it within the national security law. But I do think if we open it out of the national security law, there are real mechanisms for enforcing the Article 4, and in particular, the ICCPR provision. So the ICCPR provision right now, the Human Rights Committee has issued a list of issues to the Hong Kong government, of which now the Hong Kong government is supposed to respond. And I think that is a tremendous opportunity for us to push for the wide, diverse, inclusive consultation that is required in preparing a government, not just the Hong Kong government, any government's response to a treaty body list of issues. And so that's an immediate opportunity. I should point out that all of the list of issues in the current list of issues related to national security, anti-sedition, anti-terrorism, have requested all of the questions, the very excellent questions that you have posed in your book. They actually pose as list of issues that the Hong Kong government must respond to. So they may not respond to the questions posed in your book, but they're going to have to provide some responses to the Human Rights Committee. For example, what is the relationship between the ICC, the covenant, and the national security law? What are the measures in place to ensure that the application and enforcement of the law are not contrary to the covenant? What are the procedural and legislative measures envisioned to enforce Article 56 and 57? What is the scope of the application on extraterritorial application? Could they clarify the meaning of the phrase collusion with a foreign government? What are the elements and powers and immunities to the Committee for Safeguarding and the National Security in the Office for National Security? What are the accountability mechanisms for overseeing those bodies? And finally, what are you doing about amending it or envisioning amending it to the laws? So I think those are all perfect, legitimate, safe openings for all of us, whether academics or the public or civil society, to say, hey, let's have consultations on that. Let us have inputs into that. I know some part of your book raised the question of concern for activists and lawyers who participate and contribute to the UN system. However, that happens to be a widely shared concern at the UN and the human rights system. And so recently, a couple of years ago, I believe, or more than that, a special new mandate was set up on reprisals. In other words, the special mandate on reprisals now reports that any lawyer, defender, civil society member that suffers reprisal, that is intimidation, harassment, disappearance, prosecution, anything, in response to an effort to participate and to exercise their rights, can be reported. And then also there will be follow-up action. So I think those are all really important. The last thing I would say is that why I think we have such a challenge to talk meaningfully and constructively about the national security law is that it requires 3 bodies of jurisprudence and expertise in 3 bodies of jurisprudence. It requires experts in national or mainland law, like Professor Fu Haoling, and who are experts in Chinese criminal law, who are constitutional law scholars of mainland law, who know Chinese national security and really understand the whole structure of the law. The second is you really need Hong Kong law experts who really understand common law jurisprudence, but also understand that many of the laws that are referenced that you talked about in the implementing regulation for Article 43, that vastly expands the investigatory and the arrest and powers of the police. In fact, the implementing regulation references many other Hong Kong laws. However, when you look at those Hong Kong laws, a big question that's raised is why? Because those laws that are ordinances that are referenced have different legislative purposes, had a different legislative context, and in some cases have conflicts with the national security law on police powers. In other words, different levels that are required for approving supervisory on certain surveillance and things like that. So I think Hong Kong law experts, can really go in there but it needs all of us. And then the third body is international human rights experts. And unfortunately, I think we need all of us in the room. And Professor Fu Haoling and HKU in particular have really been organizing and convening what, Michael, you called for in your book, saying we need to have rigorous intellectual analysis linked with organizational capacity to address these complex challenges. And I think one thing that Professor Fu has been a leader on is to convene these very rigorous spaces so that we can talk in a very technically rigorous way, and to say, how can we think about law to cabin and to think about that it is possible to reform. And I think finally, I'll say two quick things about why I think, like Michael, I would just encourage you. I'm the last person on earth to discourage optimism, but I think that your clear aim at the end for the book is a constructive one, and it is to that you hope that the arguments made will somehow get Beijing to course correct. In other words, you cite the law of physics, which is absolutely right. The greater this way, the greater this way. So more repression, more, more resistance. But, only, you know the saying, only crazy people keep doing something that doesn't work, or desperate people, or confident people, or insecure people, all of which you have suggested is possible. But I think what you then say is that you're hoping that Beijing, in the course of this kind of constructive analysis, will course correct. And I really feel that's a little bit like asking the tiger for its skin. I don't think it's gonna, I think Andy might or may not agree with me. I don't think Beijing will say, hey, sounds like a good idea, we'll course correct. Here's my skin, I think that may not be too likely. So having said that, let me just suggest that a metaphor that we use, Human Rights in China issued a pretty extensive white paper on the national security law. It's on our website, and we do a pretty deep dive analysis of the law, but within an international human rights frame. And I think the title of our white paper basically says our whole perspective. Too soon to concede the future. We believe we need to not give up on the futures, plural, and that we're only 23 years in. We're only 23 years in, and we've got like another 27 years. And, if you think back 2 years ago, 3 years ago, who would have envisioned 2019, a million March? Who would have envisioned COVID-19? Who would have envisioned, my goodness, what's happening in the US now? I mean, so I think that we really have a fair long future, and there's space, because in some respects, the metaphor we use is Beijing with genuine perceived fear of the security threat Hong Kong posed. I think it's genuine. I don't think it's fake. It was genuine. Then railroaded through the national security law. But what it's like is that they rushed to take off in a plane, but they didn't check if they had enough fuel. They didn't check if they had a map. They didn't, the May 25th decision is the map, but the map is not the territory. So they took off with a map that doesn't really map out the territory, and they weren't sure how to land the plane. So I think this is where we are, in a pretty constructive place, because they need to land the plane. And you think you can help them land the plane by saying course correct. And we think they can land the plane, but they need a different map. And the map has to include, a route that respects human rights. And the last thing I'll say about the law is that, and we thank Professor Fu Haling for his very, all errors remain ours. We don't want to put any mistakes onto Professor Fu, but we want to thank him for his very helpful input we did a very thorough translation. As you know, Hong Kong is a bilingual jurisdiction, and English and Chinese are both and should be legally authoritative. But now we are stuck with the most major law that impacts every aspect of Hong Kong people's life, as well as the structure of Hong Kong, and it's only legally authoritative in Chinese. And the Chinese translation, which is on the government website, we believe had many inaccuracies, and we felt that it was really important that we conveyed, because law, particularly in a common law jurisprudence, that when you are restricting rights, you have to narrowly and accurately interpret the law. But if you can't even read the law accurately, you can't narrowly interpret the law. And the other aspect of the translation that's now on the official site is that it seems to not accurately convey the ideological and political context and tone of the key provisions of the Chinese text. So we have a whole host of recommendations in our white paper as well, but the easy, low-hanging fruit is issue an accurate and legally authoritative translation of the law. And Phil Dykes, the chair of the Hong Kong Bar Association recently, in the defense of a case, made, I think, a submission to the court and said, I do not read Chinese, and I am defending my client, and I do not read Chinese, and I'm dealing with this translation, right? And I have no way of knowing. And so the court rejected the submission. So I think that at its very foundational sense, we should all be pushing for a legally authoritative, accurate English translation. I don't know if Welling, if I have 2 seconds, I would just like, why it's so important is, for example, in the definition of a crime, Article 21, a person who incites, assists, and in the official translation, incites, assists, and abets, or provides, et cetera, is guilty of an offense. But the Chinese is not abet. Abet is a very narrow verb, and the Chinese is counsel. So it's much broader. In other words, you could find yourself, potentially guilty of an offense because it's much broader. The other one is Article 6 as an example of ideological tone. It says it's a common responsibility of the people of China, including the people of Hong Kong, to safeguard the sovereignty, unification and territorial blah, blah. The Chinese is not people of Hong Kong. The Chinese is Hong Kong Tongbao, Hong Kong compatriots. And why that's important is because compatriots is a term commonly used by the United Front. And it's used by the United Front to refer to Hong Kong, Macau, and Taiwan. And it really has the overtones of claiming territorial jurisdiction, et cetera. So anyway, I commend that to your, to the people who have joined us, if you haven't seen it, that the Annex A might be of some use, and the white paper might be of some use. And I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you. Michael, do you want to respond to the comments first?
Yeah, I can make I would only like to respond in the form of thanking. I now understand why Hualing and I, in our contemplation of this event, were so keen to have Andy and Sharon as speakers, because you have brought exactly that part that I probably didn't bring sufficiently to the table. I knew Andy would be able to connect it to the wider politics, and I appreciate that a lot. In the book, you may know, I set aside trying to guess what China's reasons for doing these things were, and focused more on view from Hong Kong. And the same, I talked about international developments, but I didn't want to get off in that area too far, other than to couch it in the language of Hong Kong. So what was going on in Hong Kong. That was my goal. When it comes to course changing, of course, I'm not naive. I don't think they're going to change their course. In a book that's, at least 50–60% about civil society, I think governments only change their course when somehow they feel compelled to do so by conditions in the society, either expressed by the people, as we see some from time to time. In a democracy, that happened this past week in Washington. There may be a course correction there. In a non-democratic context, the second thing I said, appreciating the course correction, may not be what would happen, at least in the short term, that it really lays on us all, both locally in Hong Kong and globally outside of Hong Kong, to be a part of how this narrative is shaped. And it may not be comfortable speaking out. In Hong Kong, I think it's become very uncomfortable, and the pressures that people are feeling. In the book, I draw a narrative across the time that I'm talking about, from hopefulness to fear. And along the way, lots of feelings that people were having and experiencing. Trepidation, for example, is a word I use. And I actually shoved these things in little vignettes between the chapters, expressing what the emotion was at the time, because I shared those emotions with the Hong Kong. So I think now judges are going to face pressure, but some judges are going to stand up to it, and that's going to happen. Legislators are under pressure and they're standing up and they're voicing themselves. And the Hong Kong teachers are expressing themselves, and journalists. So I think that's kind of, when governments aren't correcting on their own, those are important things. And I think if we as in the academy have a contribution, it's to somehow try to make sense of it, to locate this conversation and the voices inside it. So I think that is where I appreciate the panel here and what we're hearing. I'm not advocating a rebellion or anything, but simply that people are going to be expressing their concerns over time. And we're going to have to see if the government ever is willing to listen. I think there's been a very shortage of that. I've been very surprised that there's been within the government almost no one who stood up and says, no, I'm not going to do this. This is going too far. I object. I think that's a problem. And then now we have a hotline to report on people. I think this hotline is really of concern to me, because I think in China, one of the areas where reporting on people has been such a prominent thing has been in universities and schools. So I'm afraid the hotline may become a vehicle for reporting on what teachers are saying and doing in classrooms. And so this can injure the society. So that means, do we continue to say and do what we think needs to be said? So that, I think, is more than the government changing course on its own, really the spirit of the argument. One other thing I didn't mention, and I just would add it in and then I'll stop. And that is, I think one of the things that's worried me is that the national security law has become a platform for not just the national security law itself, but for nearly all of the public order laws in Hong Kong. They're sort of being now wrapped in each other. And I think this is a real concern, so that now if somebody did something that fits under one law, then they will go after them there. If it fits comfortably under the national security law, they'll use that. But we can't just see the consequence. The government says, well, only a few people will be the target of this law. And we can't see that consequence in that narrow terms, because now some of the charges are rioting, they're sedition, they're different kinds of even unauthorized assemblies. All of these things I think are wrapped in together. And I don't think it's going to encourage public support and patriotism and the kind of values that the government would like to see, but rather resistance. And I'm hoping some calmer heads some voices might be heard and appreciated in the government camp, and not the sort of anger that I see now. I mean, I really see anger towards judges, anger towards legislators who are not agreeing with the dominant group in the Legislative Council. I mean, they have to understand the causes of that anger. That anger, I mean, the anger that the protesters are expressing, the anger that the minority of legislators are expressing, because they perceive that they represent a majority of Hong Kong people, but they're silenced. So getting outraged and offended by their obstructionism and so on, I think in many ways is misplaced. What needs to happen, I think, is a kind of understanding of what's going on and more listening. So maybe that degree of course correction could even still be imagined. I'm hopeful. I'll stop there. I've said too much, but I really appreciate all three of you here supporting this discussion. Thank you.
All right. So thank you very much. We have about half an hour Q&A. So I guess I'm just to rephrase the questions. One of the question is, if So now we're into 4 months, 11 days after the national security law. If the current implementation is something we could use as a measurement for the future, so what would be the future looks like?
I guess, should I be the first guy? Maybe
Yeah.
the writer of the book that we're discussing, and I'm sure Andy and Sharon will have thoughts as well. I think the future right now, I see a lot of hopelessness that people are feeling. They're feeling this idea that the law is narrowly applied doesn't seem to be the case to a lot of people's observation. Because if you arrest a few people, but you scare a whole lot more people into silence, or you arrest a couple journalists, as occurred this week, how do the rest of the journalists feel? If you condemn someone for organizing a primary election in which 600,000 people participated, how many people are affected by that? If you tell teachers that you can't do this and you can't do that, you can't have this kind of critical discussion. I mean, even if you're trying to say it's narrowly applied, you can't engage in sedition. What is the consequence for chilling effect on free speech across educational sector? I mean, the breadth of this law in this way is, I can say, breathtaking. It just applies and affects people across the board because the kind of chilling effect it may have. So I think the future can be quite grim unless there is some kind of appreciation of this, what we call knock-on effect of the law when you apply it in one area, that it really reaches everyone. Now, there's ways of answering that I think Andy would be better than me, is what kind of international future there would be, or whether the human rights bodies and stuff that Sharon mentioned are, are they going to have any leverage in this conversation? So that's another form of future, but I focused the book on the local. So I would just comment that I think the breadth of the law is breathtaking, and I don't think so far I've seen evidence that government officials and the police unit, the special unit involved, has fully understand the impact of some of the steps they take. Philip Dykes himself, I did interviews in Hong Kong before the national security law, and Philip Dykes himself said it's when you choose to prosecute or arrest, it's not just whether there's a strict violation of the law, you have to do so in the public interest. And so we have to ask ourselves if the public interest is being served by the way the law is being carried out so far.
Right. Andy, Sharon, you have anything to add? If not, I'll just move on to the other questions.
I have something to add, which relates to a question that's in our Q&A from Wilson Leung.
Yeah.
He says, what do the panelists make of Xi Jinping's remarks a few days ago about imposing comprehensive governance of Hong Kong within the next 5 years? And I think that this question points to, Michael said so the question is, how do we see the national security law being implemented? And I think that this points to a good answer for that, is that the national security law is just the opening gambit and there will be further steps beyond it that take other forms. Now, this phrase comprehensive governance, 综合治理 in the mainland, is used to describe their very sophisticated surveillance system, where there's technical methods, cameras and computers and facial recognition, and then socially organized methods of the police and the neighborhood watch people and so on and so forth, to sort of head off criminal behavior, before the criminal even thinks of committing the crime, sort of preventive crime control. And then I think another piece of it, so although I'm not actually don't know about this speech that Xi Jinping gave a few days ago, but if he's using this phrase, I think it points to the idea that now that we have the national security law, to sort of tamp things down, we're going to unfold a whole control structure on the mainland model. And it also includes education. So Sharon mentioned about the young people, and it includes getting control of education, teaching people the right thoughts. And then if I could kick it over to Sharon, because the same questioner, Wilson Leung, asks a great question in the next slug, which is, how would the UN Human Rights Committee process put pressure on the Hong Kong and PRC governments? And somebody else has more or less the same question, you know, does it really change things when you embarrass the government in Geneva?
I thought that was a great question, but I was actually also, I can answer that in a minute, because that's a rather, that's an important question too, but I really like the question that's posed by someone about mainlanders, like why are we not—
I was going to ask you to answer that question.
Can I answer that question?
Sure, sure.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. I want to answer that question. Thank you. So one of the things I want to say is that in the whole last year, it was the first time that I actually taught in a Hong Kong law school. Prior to that, I had taught 18 years in a US law school. And then prior to that, about 10 years, you know, running these law training programs on the mainland. And so the way I view the kind of struggle for building the rule of law and protecting rights in the mainland, I really see it through my former students from the mainland and my friends and my colleagues from the mainland, and how my former students became wonderful lawyers and scholars and law teachers and judges. And so I've been a bit discouraged, you know, when I care so deeply as a Hong Konger about what's happening in Hong Kong. And when I talk to my Hong Kong students, that there was a feeling of, you know, that they were the enemy, that the mainlanders were the enemy. And I feel very importantly that that is so not constructive to anyone. And when we talk about the future, it is really important we not treat, you know, others as big blocks and enemizing, you know, making people enemies. And so a couple of things I have to suggest about that. One is Human Rights in China, my organization a few years back, we convened conversations between mainlanders, young mainlanders, who were living, working, or studying in Hong Kong. And we did 14 of these. And each one was like 9, 10, 11, 12, but people, because we wanted them to have a real conversation. And in those conversations, we were listening. And we wanted Hong Kongers to listen, and we wanted mainlanders to listen. And this is what I learned from those. It was extraordinary, and that's what we need to do. We asked, what is your vision of each other? We asked, what are your core values? We've asked, why did you come to Hong Kong? We asked, what is so important about Hong Kong? And how did you get around that? We have published one of these conversations. You can go to our website, hrichina.org. It's called Conversations Project. It was difficult because we allowed them to speak any language they wanted, and they did. So one conversation was in Cantonese, Mandarin, and English, and we had to convert them all into all English, all Mandarin, and, you know, so you can read that. The second thing is to acknowledge that there were mainland friends and colleagues and students of mine. And actually, when I taught at HKU last year, the 2 human rights seminars I taught, I had mainlanders in my class. And I thought that was really interesting, the dynamics. At NYU Law School, at my seminars, I have mainland students in the class. And I find that that is a dynamic that, because of 2019, has gotten more challenging to ensure that it is a respectful climate where people can actually listen and speak. And I think that's part of our job as teachers. But the mainlanders who have expressed support, or not even support, interest, posted photos or videos from the 2019, we have to recognize that a very that we know of, at least that we've documented, you know, several dozen, you know, were then arrested, had chats, called in for chats, intimidated. Their parents were called and said, tell them to stop posting that, don't write that. So I think mainlanders who want to speak out, you can only speak out in certain ways. And I think we need to acknowledge how difficult it is and what the risks are for mainlanders who want to engage in a frank and honest and critical way, which they should. So I think that is a very important question. And I would put the question back to the person is, in different groups that we are part of, we try to ask this question: how can we promote that conversation? And frankly, now that we're all in lockdown, I haven't been able to go back to Hong Kong all year because of lockdown. I would love the person who asked that question to also start talking and thinking about and contacting us with ideas on how can we listen? How can we have that conversation? Because I'm telling you, we are so open and we welcome it. And also because we think it's absolutely critical to the future of the mainland and to Hong Kong. And I'm not discounting old people like myself and my colleagues. I think the young people have to talk to each other. And Professor Johannes Chan actually said, the best contribution, like if I raise it from the level of people talking, young people talking, structurally, Johannes Chan said, the best contribution Hong Kong can make to the social, economic, and political development of China is to retain Hong Kong's differences and uphold its core values. And that really is what many of the young people who participate in the conversation said to us. We so respect Hong Kong's core values. We respect you stand online. We respect that you're polite. We respect, that you're civil. And the Hong Kongers in the group said, oh, you do? It was like, what? And they said, yeah, we're very pained when we hear you criticize mainlanders. It's painful, and so I think we need to hear that. And we are speaking different languages. We are from different cultures, actually. And so we really see it as reaching out and figuring out better ways to do it. And I know that Professor Fu Haling is really like one of the most gentle masters of this bridging. But I do think all of us really need to do that more. And thank you for the question. It's a really important one.
Do you want to go back to the Human Rights Committee question? How useful the process will be?
Yeah. So the first part of the answer is Michael Davis's answer. So Michael, I'm going to give your answer to that, which is, you said at the beginning of the book that the ultimate guardians of the rule of law in Hong Kong were the people and the streets. That the ultimate guardians, you really can't, in some ways, human rights are too important to be left to just governments. Like, it really requires the people to be the guardians, just like democracy in the US. You can't rely on the parties, you can't rely on the government. If we want democracy, we, the people, have to do the hard work. We have to get educated, we have to be careful about fake news, we have to vote, we have to be voting in an educated way, and then we have to be willing to engage the people we disagree with. That's what it takes. Now, on the Human Rights Committee, this is how it works, Wilson, thank you for the question, is that it's not that the Chinese, that the SAR government simply responds. That's just not how it works. The process is this. They are supposed to convene broad, diverse, inclusive public consultations. Now, that is supposed to go into the report. They're going to say, this is what we convened, X number of groups and X number of people consulted. We got X number of submissions. So first level is you can submit, and if they don't consult, which is the more likely scenario, all civil society groups can submit directly to the Human Rights Committee. You can do it as an individual, you can do it as a group, you don't have to be an NGO, anyone can do it. So if you're interested in doing that, please talk to us, and we're very interested in training people so that you submit fairly technical, good documents. The third thing you can do is you monitor the actual review. This is public, this is live streamed. This is before COVID, it was live streamed. And so when you monitor the actual review, you watch the question and answers that the committee will say, no, that's not a good answer. And I'm telling you, it's not just the government responds and then the committee, which is formed of independent experts serving in their personal capacity. The Human Rights Committee happens to be one of the stronger treaty bodies because they are very expert. They've tended to be a lot of lawyers on, and they've tended to be very rigorous. The Human Rights Committee also has a grading system, which not all the committees have, and Hong Kong's prior reviews have gotten bad grades. Like they'll say, what progress have you made when we express concern about universal genuine suffrage? We don't think 2014 was a genuine progress. What progress have you made since then? And then they gave answers, or they didn't answer, or they ignored. This goes back and forth. And then you get a C or a B or a D, So, it's like responsive, non-responsive, ignored the question, blah, blah, blah. So they actually got grades in some of the follow-up answers. And Hong Kong people should be more on top of that and say, what? That's embarrassing. We got a C. And, try to wrap it up. So the third area is, aside from that, is that there will be final recommendations and implementations. And it's for civil society to be monitoring the implementations and the limits of those. And I will just say that you have to be in it for the long haul. Don't think it's a one-day thing, and the next round of the reviews will be very critical because of the critical situation Hong Kong is in. But this is why we need more local Hong Kong society to be have the information. So Michael, what you did in 2003, the one-pagers, the color rainbow handouts, I think we need to go back to that with the rigorous analysis. And, Hong Kong people need to know this is the next step. And as soon as we know the calendaring of the review or when the consultations, we should be getting everyone. And I think that helps with despair. Despair is when you think nothing can be done. Despair is when you sit there and go, we're stuck in an iron box fighting with Beijing and there's nothing for us to do. That's not true. There are standards and there needs to be compliance. So Wilson, the committee cannot force the government to do anything. What they do is part of the government's treaty obligation is to constructively engage, provide the reports. Part of the treaty obligations is to implement the recommendations. It is a treaty obligation to implement the recommendations. That's why in each review they say, so what did you do? How much progress did you make? Give us specific information. And you should know that in the reviews, and also I didn't talk about the special procedures, but well back, not just recently, they have been expressing concerns and recommendations about excessive use of force by the police, genuine universal suffrage, the rule of law rollbacks. They have expressed concern about all of that, as has the Human Rights Committee, and they've given very specific recommendations. And I think we as civil society should be the guardians and the monitors to help promote a constructive engagement. That's good for China, because you should know that China cares that it is seen as a constructive player and engaging, because you look at their reports for the Universal Periodic Review, which is a state-centric review by all the member states. China puts in the next to the last section, it's called international cooperation. And in that section, they will tout their participation and constructive engagement with permitting the reports, submitting information, having civil society consultations and engagement. So you have to understand that they're using that and putting it out as a good thing. So it is a good thing. And so we should, really be part of that constructive saying, if you're going to claim it, then earn it. And we'll help you earn more constructive points by actually engaging with civil society. So I think that's what the system really is intended to do. And I don't want to get into an argument with Professor Fu-Ling and Michael Davis about international law and can you, implement if it's not justiciable. But you should know, like, for example, the South China Seas, the Maritime Tribunal issued a tribunal decision about the boundary lines for China's waters. China didn't like it, so they just ignored the decision. So, let's just be real clear here. Other tribunals can issue decisions, and it's not just China, the US. If they don't like a decision, you can't have an army go to the US government and say, do this or go to China. What it is based on is this treaty body system.
Sure. Can I ask you to wrap up?
I'm wrapped up.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry.
Thanks. Okay, can I ask Andy and Michael to give a concluding remark? I mean, all the questions, or most questions on the future, right? How things should be organized, what can be done to maintain the freedoms in Hong Kong in the area of national security law. Can I ask Andy to go first?
Oh, I'm one of these people, my mind is in the iron box that Sharon referred to. I feel that pick up from her point that Beijing is really sincere in viewing Hong Kong as a security threat. They think the ideas, they think the demonstration of disobedience, the very exercise of democracy, the separatism, the localism, and all that, because it's a country, the regime is afraid of localism in lots of different parts of the country. So I think they're really determined to unfold, keep control. And I am inspired by Sharon's remarks about the UN system. I think it does give Hong Kongers tools that they can use for advocacy, and I hope that they do it. But I think that the kinds of broad demonstrations we saw are going to be very dangerous now for individuals to participate in. And I tend to think that most people will get that message and won't be able to take that danger. So I'm kind of pessimistic about situation improving, but I do support Sharon's idea of using the UN system as an advocacy tool. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, Michael, you have the final word.
Yes, I think one of the things put in the national security law was this argument, this crime of collusion. And I think it was specifically targeted at foreign intervention as China sees it in Hong Kong. I know Jimmy Lai's, the charges against him probably arise out of, reportedly out of some support in media, newspaper ads and stuff for a slogan group called Stand with Hong Kong. And so there's clearly a Chinese aim to put pressure on any Hong Kongers doing as they have in the past, going to testify in front of foreign parliaments. And I fear even the Human Rights Committee itself, that they will be putting pressure on these people, and whether they will in fact charge people who advocate things. The subversion law says to bring the government into contempt or hatred. So they have a wide sweep of these things, I think, trying to stop all opposition, both locally and internationally. But at the same time, I think that is in fact the future. I don't think it's all about foreign criticism. I think China's imagining that foreigners are going around organizing protests in Hong Kong. They're not. I've been in Hong Kong for years. What's foreign about these things, perhaps, but it's not so foreign because it's all written into the basic law, are the ideas of freedom, human rights, rule of law. They're all in the basic law. But perhaps China views these ideas being promoted on the streets of Hong Kong as a kind of foreign intrusion. But these ideas have long been written into all the global treaties, human rights treaties, and so on, and as well into Hong Kong domestic law. What I think is going to happen in the future is Hong Kong resistance is going to start taking new forms and shapes. One of the things we saw this week is when they arrested 2 journalists, is that the Hong Kong Journalists Association speaks up and the media reports. So one of the weaknesses of a soft authoritarian regime, which China has to run in Hong Kong at its most severe, has to be a kind of soft authoritarian regime, is that they have to pretend at least to allow free speech. They have to pretend that they're going to adhere to the rule of law. So there are always going to be officials, judges, there are going to be journalists, there are going to be students, there are going to be teachers, all who can introduce ideas into the conversation in Hong Kong. And those ideas, I think, are important. They may seem difficult now, but I think it's very important that the society continue to be involved, continue to respond. Whether there will be massive protest or not, hard to say. I think there are also going to be more and more Hong Kongers abroad organizing and putting pressure on the Hong Kong and Chinese governments through information. So I don't think we're going to see a complete stoppage of opposition. but it's going to take these various forms. In fact, the kind of forms that authoritarian governments often face, which is a mix of the diaspora and foreign human rights supporters and local objection and local expressions of objection. And there's going to be an election, presumably next year, and they may disqualify half the candidates, but the pan-democratic camp will just replace them with other candidates. And the people will get, again, because the government has to at least adhere to some of what is promised, that this election be held, then as we see in places elsewhere in South and Southeast Asia, people will vote. So I think there are going to be more and more things that people are going to try to do, and more strategies. I know I forget the author of the book on nonviolent strategies, very prominent name, but it's not coming to my head. He has like 195 different strategies for nonviolence in promoting and putting pressure on governments. So I think we're going to see more and more of this. In fact, if we don't, the government should be very sad, because that will be when Hong Kong people have lost all hope. They're immigrating and taking up Britain's offer for 3 million of them to go there. I think that would be a very difficult day for Hong Kong. So I don't see that happening yet. I suppose that's what's going to happen, and that people are going to keep finding their voice.
Thank you very much. We had a very interesting conversation. So just want to thank Michael for presenting the wonderful book. I hope people would buy your book and read your book and discuss your book. And thank you, Andy and Sharon, for your wonderful contribution to the dialogue and the conversation. So also thank the audience. Thank you for coming back to our seminar. And I hope we could offer more in the future. So thank you. Have a good evening and have a good weekend.
Thank you. Thank you, guys. Thank
Bye-bye.
you, Professor Guan Ling. Thank you. Thanks, Mike. Bye, Annie.
Bye-bye.